This week, we're going to be talking about how social justice minded Christians get the idea of works wrong. They center so much of their theology, so much of their ideologies on works, certain actions that must be taken. And the idea is, oh, well, we're re-emphasizing works, which have gotten lost over the years as we've retreated somewhat from what we should be doing. And what's effective about what they're saying is they're not wrong in the criticism that we have lost some of our impact in the world when it comes to works, but they're dead wrong when it comes to the works that they're pushing and also the scale of the problem. Let's get into things. Welcome to the Enemies Within the Church podcast. You can go to EWTC News, that stands for Enemies Within the Church, EWTCnews.com to, well, view the documentary if you haven't already. Maybe get yourself a copy, get your friend a copy. You can also stay up to date with our current projects, which this podcast is part of. And if you want to support the work of the podcast and specifically all the work I do for Enemies Within Church, behind the scenes, the podcasts, other projects, you can go to the Patreon or the Give, Send, Go to support the work that I'm doing here. Again, I've mentioned this before, Enemies Within the Church, we're trying to do some larger documentary projects. We don't have the funds for side projects. So if you want to support and see this work continue, be greatly appreciated. And I try and put some updates there. I try and keep you in the loop on things. So go check things out. I'm not requiring you to do that. This is a free resource, but I would be grateful if you considered that. Now, what are we talking about? Like I said, we're going to be looking at the idea of works. This is something that's been bothering me. And I don't think... I think a lot of aspects about what we're going to be covering today are covered. But I think there are certain key things that we should put together. We should put multiple puzzle pieces together. And that's what I hope to do in this episode. And, like I said, we're going to be looking at what is a work? What is a work? What are the works that social justice minded people, woke minded people, whatever term you want to put on it, what are the works that they advocate for? And what are the works that the Bible advocates for? Are those two in alignment? Now let's get some context, because we're going to need an example of this in order to actually examine it. I'm making the claim that people are saying something. Well, let's back that up. Now, this is going to be coming from, if you don't know my history, if you haven't watched Enemies Within the Church, then you're not going to know much of my story. And even if you've watched Enemies in the Church, you may not have watched the original video I made about my time doing church planting with the North American Mission Board, the church planting arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, and the issues that came up there. And I went to the head of church planting and asked him questions, and I got certain resources provided to me that supposedly answered the questions. And yeah, if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it in the description. You can watch the whole thing I did, but we're going to be looking at one of those documents here. Now, this comes from a since deleted. Now, I don't know if it's fully deleted. They moved it around a couple times because I was posting the link. And apparently they were paying attention. And then changing the link until I just couldn't find it anymore. So it's either gone or not. But this was their values handbook. And specifically, I was directed to chapter 7, which would answer many of my questions. And let me just read the introduction. So the chapter title is Restoration Through the Great Requirement. Now, you might already have some flags going up there and going like, what is that? Sounds a little bit strange. What is that supposed to mean? Well, let's read a bit of this, get some context. Have you ever heard the saying, save the soul and the rest will follow? This, unfortunately, characterizes the historic actions of many American evangelicals. We've reduced the gospel to the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples, and the Great Commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yet, in all our evangelistic zeal, we have tragically missed a key component of the gospel. Let me repeat that line. Yet, in all our evangelistic zeal, we have tragically missed a key component of the gospel: restoration through the great requirement. And great requirement is capitalized here, just as he capitalized Great Commission and Great Commandment. We see the great requirement in Micah 6:8. Mankind, he has told each of you what is good and what it is the Lord requires of you: to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. God requires us to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with him. I find it funny that, he used a different translation than what he just said there, because in the translation he used, it's act justly, love faithfulness, and walk humbly with your God. And then he immediately says, requires to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with him. It's more of a writing something and then putting in the translation, but it's always funny when that happens. Anyway, the great requirement does not happen separately from our commission and commandment. When each are done biblically, they are intricately tied together. Simply put, making disciples should be an expression of loving God and our neighbors, and always should lean towards holistic restoration. So now he's added a new thing. Well, he's saying holistic restoration. He's saying that's the great requirement is holistic restoration. But you can see he's drifting off towards something he actually wants to talk about piece by piece. In the same way, holistic restoration should be an expression of loving God and our neighbors, and always should lead towards making disciples. Now, we could read a little bit more. I think there's enough context there for us to start to dive in. Let's break a few things down. So he introduces these three ideas. The Great Commission, Great Commandment, and Great Requirement. The key one here is the Great Requirement, hence the title of this chapter, Chapter 7. And if you want to look at this whole thing for yourself, I'm not going to relink this. The link to my original video will be in the description. That has links to multiple resources, so you can go and really check out what I'm talking about. But he introduces these three ideas: Great Commission, Great Commandment, Great Requirement. Now we're going to look at how he describes those three in just a second. But then he describes a verse. He says, this is the verse that lays out the great requirement. And then he starts to talk about it. He says it doesn't happen separately from our commission and commandment, that these are three things that happen together, three separate things that happen together. They must be put together. And when we each are done biblically, again, they are intrinsically tied together. Oh, intricately tied together. I'm sorry, I said intrinsically. Simply put, making disciples, pay attention here. Making disciples should be an expression of loving God and our neighbor, and always should lead towards holistic restoration. So he's creating a bit of an order here. You have making disciples. This is an expression of loving neighbor loving God, loving neighbor, and always leads to holistic restoration, sort of ABC pattern. Then he flips it around the other way. In the same way, holistic restoration should be an expression of loving God and our neighbor and always lead toward making disciples. Well, this is strange when you really think about it. This is strange when you really think about it. Because both the Great Commission and the Great Requirement are expressions of loving God and loving neighbor. They're equally expressions of loving God and loving neighbor and how he describes it. He puts them on par. Now, you might realize that's a bit of a problem. One of those two things is not like the other. One of those is of infinite importance. Infinite importance. The other one is an outflowing of our salvation. And it's an outworking of it's works. It's what we do once we are saved. We do certain things. We do good works because we are saved, because we have faith, true faith, real faith, faith that then produces actions. And what's the motivator of those actions? It's loving God and loving neighbor. So he's saying this normal pattern of go therefore make disciples, doing that as an expression of loving God, and then from there continuing on and doing good works for those people that you are discipling, but just doing good works in general. He's then flipping that around. He's saying, well, there's another route. There's another route here, and it starts with the good works as an expression of loving God and loving neighbor, just like equal to our expression of loving God and loving neighbor by preaching the gospel. He puts preaching the gospel and social action on par. These are equal things. But this loving God by doing these social actions should lead towards making disciples. Well, that's completely backwards. Completely backwards. It's changing. It says these things are of equal priority, and in fact, it's valid to supplement the social action as the primary thing that eventually leads towards preaching the gospel and discipling people. Now, I hope you can tell that's a little bit backwards. But now let's jump back. Let's jump back to the beginning of this section that we read, where he laid out the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, and the Great Requirement. Now, I'm sure you locked onto the idea of Great Requirement, but that's not where the errors start, not by a long shot. He's manipulating you right off the bat. In fact, the very first line is highly problematic. It's it's injecting an idea into your mind by creating something negative, a negative association with a phrase, and then the idea behind that phrase. Let's read it again. Have you ever heard the saying, save the soul and the rest will follow? So he's putting an idea in your head. Hey, here's this phrase, save the soul and the rest will follow. Now, I don't believe I've ever heard that phrase the way he's dropping it in there. One, he's shorting it to its minimum length and removing any sort of context or clarification. But then he's going to build off of that. And the building off is where it really starts. Let's read this. This, unfortunately, putting the word unfortunately in there, he's saying this is a negative thing, a bad thing. And he's going to tell us why. But this unfortunately characterizes the historic actions of many American evangelicals. We've reduced the gospel. Reduced the gospel. Pay attention to this. We've reduced the gospel to the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. Yet, in all our evangelistic zeal, we have tragically missed a key component of the gospel. So this is all in the context of the gospel. His argument is that we've made the gospel Great Commandment and Great Commission, and he's saying we've missed a key component of the gospel, restoration through the Great Requirement. Now, a lot of people mistakenly use gospel to cover much, much more than what the gospel actually is. Let's be a little bit technical and precise for a moment. The gospel is what? The good news. The good news of what? The good news of what Jesus Christ has done, his death, burial, and resurrection, the victory that he has won. It's all about Christ, what he has done, and through his work, through what he has done, salvation comes. The good news is the work of what Christ has done. And the end point of that is, and it brings salvation to those who believe. Then it stops there. Our justification, our sanctification, our glorification, those are not the gospel proper. Those are parts of salvation. The salvation that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the salvation that the gospel brings. I just want to be very technical for a second about that. But yes, if you're casually just saying the gospel and you're including salvation in that, I'm not going to call you a heretic. That's slightly imprecise. You should create a distinction between the gospel and salvation, the gospel and the fruits of the gospel, the fruits of the work that Christ did, the salvation that it brings. You should make a distinction there, but it is not a critical point to get that wrong. The problem is when people start talking about things outside of those, outside of the strict, the immediate gospel, the good news of Christ, and the salvation that it brings, something that is intrinsically linked to the gospel. The problem is when people start talking about things outside of that as gospel, a part of the gospel. Well, what are you even talking about? Because you're obviously not talking about the specific work of Christ. You're also not really talking about our salvation. I mean, you're talking to a degree about sanctification, but literally everything to do with the Christian life has to do with sanctification. So yeah, it's going to be connected there, but it doesn't make it the gospel. But you can see here, he's talking about, let's put the components he's brought up. Save the soul and the rest will follow. So talking about salvation, reduce the gospel, reduce the good news to the Great Commission, the preaching of the gospel, the good news, and the Great Commandment. Yet in all our evangelistic zeal, evangelism, spreading the good news, preaching the good news, we have tragically missed a key component of the gospel, restoration through the Great Requirement. And again, you go down to where we looked at the order and he flips the order around. It's presented as part of this process of evangelism. Now, he's wrong. The Great Commission, we have not reduced the gospel to the Great Commission. If we're a true Christian, we have not reduced the gospel to the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, because neither of those are gospel. Those are commands. The commission is a commissioning. It's our marching orders, our commands, what we have been commanded to do. The Great Commandment, which includes the greatest commandment and the golden rule, which he's trying to lump into one, which I believe is very intentional. I think he's trying to conflate loving God with loving neighbor as equal, when those two are, Christ makes it very clear. The second is like this. Not the first, not the greatest. The greatest is love God. Then there's this second one, this lower one, and it's love neighbor. It's not one command. Christ makes it very explicitly two, dos. But those are not gospel. So again, he's off base there as well. But he's put in his system, he's made these the key components of the gospel. And by gospel, he means really evangelism. And what's missing here is these works of restoration. And these works of restoration can be done separately from and before the preaching of the good news, the preaching of the gospel. Now, again, you might go, oh, well, yeah, of course we can do good works. We don't have to go, okay, I got to run up to this guy. Like, I see an old man trying to cross the road. I'm sorry, it's an old lady. It's always an old lady crossing the road. I see an old lady trying to cross the road. I'm going to help her cross the road. Whoops, okay. Ma'am, I need to preach the gospel to you before I can help you cross the road. No, of course you can help her across the road. You can immediately initiate that action. That's a good thing to do. You should do that. You should also talk with her about the gospel. But you don't need to wait to initiate that action. You don't need to wait to do the right thing until you've preached the gospel. Is that what he's saying here? No, because he's putting these two things as equals. The Great Commission and the Great Requirement. These social actions are equal to and just as important as saving souls. Again, he brought up the term of save the soul. He's comparing saving souls to social work. Again, this is backwards. Now, I want to quickly come back to save the soul and the rest will follow. Since I brought that up, I want to talk about it. I have heard that phrase before, but not reduced to the way he's making it. Because what he's saying is wrong. But granted, what he's advocating for is wrong. And in fact, it includes the negative use of that phrase. Because what he's reducing it to, is a phrase that's supposed to mean, oh, well, all we're supposed to do is see someone come to Christ, and then we'll kind of figure it out from there. We're not responsible to them after that point. That's the implication of what he's saying. Oh, we're taking all we're taking works out of it. Well, I'm sorry, but the Great Commission is a work. It's a commandment, and it's more than just save the soul. It already contains more than save the soul. Make disciples. That's not just simply seeing someone saved. And what does Christ say? Teaching them to obey all that I have commanded. So we're to take them and teach them. They're ignorant. Even when they come to Christ, they're ignorant. They need to be taught what is good, what is true, what is right. So we disciple them in that process. We see them grow. We see them enter into the process of sanctification and start to be conformed to what? Conformed to the, what, this holistic restoration vision? No, conformed to the image of Christ. That's the goal. That's the target. That's what we're building them up in. And from there, good works will follow. The phrase save the soul and the rest will follow, the way I've always heard it, either through context or through a longer statement than simply that, is about, hey, none of these actions you do for this person are going to stick. They're not going to be of any true worth until this person is saved. What is better? Getting someone off drugs and then having them never come to faith? Or having them come to faith, seeing that salvation first. And then through that, through their new love for Christ, which they did not have before, they could not follow the greatest commandment, nor the golden rule. They couldn't follow those until they came to Christ. They know the love of God, so now they can reflect the love of God. They've been shown mercy, so now they can be merciful. They have been shown the truth, now they can live by the truth. And we can take them and get them cleaned up. It's the whole idea of teach a man to fish. Give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. That's how I've always heard that phrase used. Now, let's give him the slightest benefit of the doubt here and say that he's heard it used the way that he's saying. And I'm sure that people have. I'm sure there are people in their ignorance have said, well, my only responsibility is to see them come to Christ. And once they say that, they say the sinner's prayer, I'm gone. And unfortunately, that is a true thing. That is a true thing. People can get upset by pointing out the inefficiency of the great crusades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and so on, the Billy Graham style ones. People get upset because like, oh my goodness, that was, I got saved, my friend got saved, whoever it was, I know someone who got saved. Look at all the good those provided. Unfortunately, all the statistics, even, to quote Billy Graham himself, he estimated that only 25%, not of people that attended, 25% of people that professed faith at one of his rallies, his estimation was only 25% of those people were genuine. He really was. He knew it too. At least he knew it. He was going for quantity, not quality. And there was a huge problem. Again, he acknowledged it. Huge problem of actually getting those people into discipling relationships, getting them into churches, getting them connected with other Christians. Huge problem. The unfortunate thing is statistics, following the Billy Graham crusade in particular, because it's the biggest one. I'm not picking on Billy. I'm just using that because it was the biggest, so there was more studies going on. Some studies showed that it was not 25%. It was as low as 6%. And that was just for some evidence of faith 1 year later. And it was pretty low bar there. So yeah, there was a time when there was a lot of people that were going out and just saying, hey, say this prayer, get saved, and then I'm gone. I'm out of here. And that really embodied a lot of evangelism. I know that personally. I've talked a tiny bit about my past. Wasn't quite that, but that's not that far off from how the gospel was preached to me. And so many of my friends, and now the majority of those friends, are no evidence of faith. And it took me a lot of trial and tribulation before I finally realized I wasn't saved. I didn't believe this. I didn't have true faith. But this idea of reducing the gospel to the Great Commission, what is he doing here? He's, as we've already seen further down, he himself is reducing what the evangelism is, what the purpose, functionally, he's reducing what salvation is. He really is pushing a social gospel. This idea that it's about social systemic change, not individual salvation. The gospel is a social work, not a work for individuals. That the Great Commission, that salvation, these are these social things, these group things, not about seeing individual souls saved. Again, it's why he harps on the idea of save the soul and the rest will follow. He doesn't seem to like the idea of saving the soul. He wants to put forth, no. We don't need to even think about that until later on. Now, I don't think he really goes to that later on point. Again, you can read more, and it seems to never get there. It seems to be all about the holistic restoration, these social justice actions, social justice works. And then that is doing the work of the gospel. But let's quickly talk about Micah 6:8 and just kind of great commission, great command. Because I already mentioned Great Commission is law. It's a command. The greatest commandment, golden rule, commands. In fact, those two are summaries of the law. What did Jesus say? That all of the law and prophets rest on these. So it's a summary of the law. Well, that's exactly what Micah 6:8 is. The first time I ever heard this preached on, and then referenced many, many times after that, because the pastor liked to bring it up, it was usually in the mentioning of the summary of the law. And it was usually in the discussion of the greatest commandment. Because he talk about the law. I might get this slightly wrong, but Mount Sinai, it was summarized in 10 laws. Micah summarizes it in 3, and then Jesus reduces it to 2. Because it really is. That's what Micah is doing here. He has told each of you what is good. Well, what has God told these people? Where do they know good from it? Well, they know it from God's law, from his word, from what he has told them what is good and what is not good, what is lawful and unlawful, what is right and what is wrong. And this is what the Lord requires. Again, law, requirement. Act justly, love faithfulness, walk humbly with your God. Well, we see love God and love neighbor in there. We see the 2 greatest commandments in there. So he's using something that no one calls the great requirement. I made a mistake about that at one point because I did some research and thought I found someone. I thought Spurgeon did. No, it was actually someone retitling one of his sermons to then promote social justice. Whoops. But he's bringing in this new thing, ill-defined thing, something that's already covered in the Great Commandment and the Golden Rule. He's taking something that's already covered in those, and then he's going, ha! Now I can invent something completely new. And he does. He zooms off. He drops the great requirement, and now it's holistic restoration. Well, I got to be honest. Where is this idea of holistic restoration in Micah 6:8? Act justly, love faithfulness, and walk humbly with your God. I don't see anything in there. Anything in there that's specific about holistic restoration. It's personal focused. What are you to do? It's not about, the idea of holistic restoration is, it's a result. Micah 6:8 talks about These are the things you should be doing. Holistic restoration, he's talking about here's the results that you should be bringing about. They're different categories. Now, obviously, if you're doing a certain action in the right way, it's going to have a result. But still, where is this idea of holistic restoration in Micah 6:8? And specifically, that is distinct from love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Where is the holistic restoration that is distinct from those two? It's not there. Because he's just picking a verse to then say, oh, we must do these social justice works. We must bring holistic restoration spiritually, emotionally, economically, and socially. We have to make other people's problems our problems. We have to love people like Jesus did, because he saw people as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. A shepherd is primarily responsible for being with the sheep. Jesus was distressed because there was a multitude of people without anyone to be with them. No! That is not what Jesus was distressed by. That's not what he had a problem with. He wanted to see people. He wanted to see restoration. He wanted to see restoration between these people and him. There's no restoration more holistic than that. That is eternal. Eternal. Nothing in this life stands up to that. Now, once we have that restoration, once our relationship with God has been restored, it produces works. Now, let's talk about that, because like I said, I think we have a problem especially in the past 20 years of reducing Christianity, not the gospel, Christianity, reducing theology to a set of beliefs separate from the actions that they produce. God gave us his word, not so that we would simply know things, but that we would know what to do, how to live this life. Sanctification, being conformed to the image of Christ, cannot happen without actions. It produces a result. I mean, this is exactly what James talks about. In James 1, when he talks about faith without works is dead, he's talking about the need for action. That, hey, if you truly have right belief, it produces right action. If you don't have right belief, then no action is going to come, or at least no right action. Wrong action might. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? He's asking a rhetorical question here. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, and yet he says a good thing, a right thing, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? What use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead. Now, what is James saying here? Is he saying we need social justice action? Well, let's talk about something. If a brother, what's talking about first, immediately, he's talking about in the context of the church. He's not just talking about randomly socially. It starts. It's not saying we don't do good things for those outside the church. It's saying it starts. How can you, who claim that someone's your brother, your family, how can you not, if you actually have that faith that makes you too part of God's family, if you actually have that, how could you watch him have a need and not fill that need? How? This is exactly what Christ is talking about when he gives the whole list of, I was naked and you clothed me, I was hungry and you fed me, in prison you visited me. He clarifies, what you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Talking about Christians. What we do for one another in Christ, we do. What we do for the body, we do for the head. It's super important. When we do not care for the body, we disrespect the head. If you have faith in the head, you're going to care for the body. But more than that, that's part of loving God with everything you got. It's going to go further than that, though. And you're going to love your neighbor, your unsaved neighbor. We just talked about loving your brother. But then there's the next commandment, love your neighbor. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Whew. Clarifies a bunch right there. Someone might say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. He's saying, I have both. And he's saying you need both. You can't have the works without the faith. You can't have the faith without the works. That's the way it works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. Demons have a lot of beliefs, but they don't have they don't have true faith. They rebel against God. They hide from the truth. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? What is James saying here? And how do we relate this to what we've been talking about? Well, James is telling us that true faith, this is an important thing, true faith produces good works. Now, there's a couple things we need to fill in. Because, elsewhere it says, you'll know them by their fruit. We'll be able to recognize people by their fruit. And, just a week or two ago, had some more missionaries show up. And that's one of their favorite things to pull out. Hey, well, the Bible says that you'll know them by their fruit, and look at our good fruit, our good works. Well, by the standard here, does that mean that they're saved? Certainly not. Obviously not. So what's going on? Well, we have to do what the Mormons aren't doing, and what the author of that document wasn't doing, which is define our terms. What is a work? What is good? What is faith? You'll know them by their fruit. Well, what fruit are we talking about? We're talking about the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Those are the kind of fruits. Fruits of what? Fruit of the Spirit. You have to have the right spirit. Only from the Spirit do these good fruit get produced. These good works. Well, where do they get produced from? They are produced from true faith. True faith gives us access to bearing fruit. You can do works. Jesus clarified this. There are going to be many people that come to him and say, Lord, Lord, did we not X, Y, Z? in your name, and he's going to say, "Depart from me, I never knew you. You had works, you had no faith. Your works were useless because there was no faith behind it. Just like faith is useless if it has no works. Why? Because it's false faith. True saving faith produces good works, but let's take it a little bit further. Because again, we have to define things. What does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to have good? And what does it mean to have works? Works, again, there's something you do. We already looked at some of them. Naked and clothing people, taking care of physical needs. You're going to do good works. And you're going to start where? We already clarified that. It's going to start within the church. New Testament is clear about that over and over again. You do good, but especially to those in the household of the faith. That's where you start. If you can't even take care of people in the church, what are your good works outside the church? They're virtue signaling. They're fake. Who wants to come to a faith that can't even take care of its own? So this idea that we can start outside the church, that's wrong. It's wrong. It's the whole airline thing. You got to put on your own mask before you help someone else with their oxygen mask. You're useless if you shrivel up and die while trying to help someone else. Because then they're not helped either. You never got to the thing that actually mattered. But what is good? Well, this one's easy to answer. Good is not defined by us. It's not defined by some social justice action. It's not defined by the fake works that the Mormons try and do. Say, oh, look, we did something that's good by a human standard. That's the key right there. What does Jesus say? Jesus said, no one is good but God alone. He's making a pretty profound statement there. It's justified and echoed throughout the rest of the God's word that the standard for good is not, I did something okay. I did something better than someone else. I did something that produced a desirable result. I did something that felt good. No. It's God is good. His nature, by nature, he is good. Good is measured by him. So that's our standard. That's what a good work is. It's a godly work. Well, how do we know good? Well, again, Great Commission. We got to teach people to what? We got to disciple them in the knowledge of Christ, what he has commanded, what he has said is good, what his word, what the Bible says is good and true and right. We have to teach them the commands of Christ. And once we do that, we show them what is good, and we show them how to measure good fruit. But faith. What is faith? Let's jump over and read a tiny bit from 1 Peter. As we draw this to a close, let's read a tiny bit from 1 Peter. Let's read it. Let's start at verse 1 of chapter 1. To those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father by the sanctifying work of the Spirit to obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in the fullest measure. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We've had it repeated already twice here. It's salvation by, we're going to another passage. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. We see that here. Obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with his blood, covered by his blood. Born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We've got the resurrection and we've got the death of Christ. You need to be covered by the blood of his sacrifice. You need to be empowered, living hope through the resurrection of Christ. You need to what? Obey Christ. How are we brought to this obedience? Through the sanctifying work of the Spirit. Obedience is a genuine faith brings about, again, talking about the Spirit, talking about sanctification, talking about fruit of the Spirit. This is where it comes from. Verse 4, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. Our salvation is secure in heaven. It rests not in us, but in God. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, various temptations, so that the proof of your faith, the genuineness, the truth of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though it is tested by fire, may be found to result. So this tested faith, this faith that's put into action. We are in this world. We have to deal with reality. We have to interact. Is that faith producing something? May be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. True faith produces praise and glory and honor to Christ. And though you have not seen him, you love him. Love him. Loving God is part of this true faith. And though you do not now see him, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible, full of glory, obtaining as outcome of your faith the salvation of your soul. The type of faith that we have is a committed faith to Christ, one that includes obedience, one that includes praise, one that includes love. It's a bonding to Christ. A bonding to Christ. That is the type of faith that we're talking about. And then that faith produces godly works in accordance with God's word, what he has commanded. True faith, true works, good works, truly spirit-enabled spiritual fruit. Not social justice action. Now, we could go into more details of, okay, well, what are examples of faith being put into action, into these works? What are examples there? But we've covered enough for now. I hope you've got a clear understanding. They're making a problem here. There's a problem here. They're confusing law and gospel. But it goes further than that. They're using that to then create a twisted, a perverted view of what good works are, what true faith is, and what true faith produces. With all that said, I hope that's giving you some clarity. If it has, go ahead and let me know. I want to hear your feedback. Even if you have to say, hey, I didn't get what you were saying, I don't see it. Let me know that, because that helps me be clearer in my communication. I'm here for you. I want to communicate to you. So let me know your thoughts. Thank you for being here for another episode. This is going to be I'm going to do at least one more episode this year before we go on break for Christmas and getting ready for the next season. I'm going to do at least one more episode. This might be the last sort of regular episode, though. But just know we're getting towards that break. Podcast is going to resume next year in probably the second or possibly third week of January. Thank you for being here for another episode of the Enemies Within the Church podcast. Remember, you can go to EWTCnews.com to view Enemies Within the Church, the documentary, stay up to date with the project. You can also go to the Patreon or the Give, Send, Go linked in the description to support my work in this project. God bless you, and remember, don't go woke.